Okay, so it's become clear that we thought we were at a housing conference today. It's actually about the state of the nation, and which is puts us in focus. So we've heard from both local politicians, local political views. We've now heard very kindly the central government views. I think it's time we turn to one of our own, and I'm very pleased today that we have a well-respected leader of our industry to give a State of the Nation address as our industry sees it. Previously Chief Valuer of New Zealand, previously Chief Crown Property Officer, currently Chair of the Construction Safety Council, and also in his spare time Chief Executive of the Registered Masters Builders Federation. Please would you welcome Warwick Quinn.
Good morning, everybody. Lovely to be here. I'm going to give you a bit of a presentation which reinforces what Dr. Smith was saying, but come at it from a more of a property perspective as opposed to simply a construction one. And I think that this clicker is the one that works. Is that correct? If I just click this forward, it should go to the first slide. Very good. So I'm going to talk a bit about various things, the New Zealand market activity in general. Talk about Canterbury and Auckland because they're two of the hottest markets we've got at the moment. Talk about the Reserve Bank's LVR policy and why it was so important we exempted new homes. And then some forecasts around from various agencies relating to where we'll be in the next 5 or 6 years. So residential building activity has been pretty bad the last 5 years. We bottomed out in 2011 at a little over 13,500 houses. I mean, it was the lowest level of activity since 1965. We've been growing reasonably steadily since then, and this year we're expecting in the order of maybe 23,000 new homes and apartments. But most interestingly, the bulk of that work is coming out of Canterbury and Auckland, and it's now about 60% of all New Zealand activity coming out of those two regions. So if you look at the graph, you can see it pretty squarely there. And what is the most interesting part of that sort of set of statistics is the blue line shows apartments. Apartments tend to be more speculative. 90-odd% of all construction work in residential in New Zealand is commissioned. In other words, it's not done on spec. So when the market gets hotter and we have a good property market, we see more spec in the market simply because there's less risk associated with it at that time. And then this is a graph that I always show because it really highlights the fact that the orange line, which is construction activity, and the green line, which is the whole market activity for the sale of houses, we are a complete subset of the wider residential market. If the market goes up, building activity goes up. If the market goes down, building activity goes down. It is not counter-cyclical. It never will be, because it is simply our biggest competition for a new home is the price of an existing home. So it's a very strong relationship. Our problem is we just simply aren't building enough of them. And if you look at this line here, this is from Brands. This shows the two components of a home since the early 90s, that the cost of labour and the cost of materials have essentially followed each other quite closely and slightly above the cost of inflation over that last 25-year period. So really the cost of construction isn't one of the key reasons why the cost of housing is so expensive. This is an interesting projection from Stats New Zealand. It's the size of our household. Our households, the number of people living in a home, is getting smaller. So by 2021 and 2026, we'll be down to about 2.3 people per dwelling unit as opposed to 2.6. So you'd think in theory our houses should be getting smaller to accommodate that level of living. We might need more of them, but simply that statistic has been on the go now for the last 20 years. Housing affordability, no matter how you measure it, has been getting worse. These are Reserve Bank figures, and for the best part of 40 years, we tended to average about 3 times disposable income as what the value of a house or the cost of a house was. And there's all sorts of ways you can measure it and all sorts of different things. But the Reserve Bank uses these figures, and you'll see since the early 90s, that's just grown basically exponentially. That's up to 2009, and it's shot away again more recently, particularly in Auckland. And there's a survey out called the Demographia Survey. You've seen that, heard that? Which is an international survey which shows that New Zealand is one of the least affordable property markets in the world. What I also find interesting is the builds per 1,000. We talk about 6,000 builds in Canterbury and 8,000 in Auckland or whatever it means. It's hard to actually grapple with what that actually means until you compare it to the rest of the New Zealand market. So Canterbury is clearly our star performer at a little over 10 new homes and apartments per 1,000 people. Auckland, which is where the real problem child is languishing below halfway, at a little over 4 houses and apartments, or 4 new dwelling units, built per 1,000 people. And it's been there for some time. So it really is underperforming, and you can see that in its house prices. But even more interesting is our dwelling construction rate over the last 40 years. It's actually dropped quite dramatically, again, since the early to mid-90s. So we're now building, on average, a little around 4 houses per 1,000 people, whereas from 1980 through till sort of the early 90s, we're up around 6. So we have 20 years of really low construction in comparison to where we were when house prices were a lot more stable and activity was pretty normal. So what's caused that problem? Well, here's house price indices, and here are the 3 components or 2 components that make up the cost of a property when you're building it. If you look, it started in 1992, these are Brand's figures, and you'll see that the section price, which is the top line, has gone up 5 times on that indice. Oh, sorry, I haven't clicked it over. There you go. The cost of construction, dwelling and land, is the blue line, and the general cost of inflation and construction costs is the one below it. So the key driver in property prices and construction costs, if you take land and improvements together, is land. It's grown exponentially. And by the way, it's grown since the early 90s when construction rates have dropped and all those other things have happened at the same time. That's no coincidence. If you look at the average section price, when I first started off as a valuer and I was in practice, we used to use about 25% of the total value of the property was land, right? And that was about right. Back in 1987, shows you how old I am, but that was about where it was, and it was there for some years, okay? The cost of the section back then was around, this is New Zealand average, around 35 grand. Now it's 200 grand. That's enormous. That growth is unbelievable. And if you look at the percentage of capital value that I started talking about earlier, it's gone from 20, 22% in the late 80s to nearly 50% today. And it's absolutely no coincidence that if you're in Long Bay and you are buying a section for $550,000, that you're having to pay $1.2, $1.3 million for those properties. There's a complete relationship between land and valuers call them improvements. It's not the dwelling or the section or the garage, it's the improvements. And the definition is the added value those improvements give to the land. So if you're buying a section for $550,000, you basically need to put a house of the same value at least to justify that land cost. Otherwise, you're undercapitalising. And the biggest fear that I have is unless you control land prices, if rapid land prices grow faster than capital values and total of land and improvements, then those improvements become redundant and they get demolished and reused more quickly than they would otherwise be. So unless you control land prices in central Auckland and the rest of New Zealand, you can put in affordable housing, but the land component will grow so quickly, those improvements will be demolished and you'll be back in the same circle again. It's really important that the land concept is understood. And that is why the average house size in New Zealand, after 80 years of being around 120 square metres, is now 220 square metres. Because the only way to justify the land price is to build bigger houses, simply because the cost of construction, I showed those earlier figures around the cost of labour and the cost of materials, doesn't make those numbers stack up. Remember, we're getting smaller households and our houses are growing. There's an element of people's desire to have bigger homes and, have 5 bedrooms and 2 lounges and 3 garages. That's certainly part of it. But the main economic driver is the price of land. And that is why that is happening. So that's a really important statistic. And for the best part of that whole century, when all those other figures lined up, we had a pretty consistent housing market, pretty consistent levels of construction activity. And then all of a sudden, from the late 80s, we're off. And it tends to coincide with the RMA and other issues, local planning requirements. So I want to talk quickly about the Canterbury region. Canterbury is really an interesting area that's happened as a result of the earthquakes. You'll see there, it's only really been the last 2 or 3 years that construction activity in Canterbury has really taken off. That's Canterbury in total, and that's a monthly average. And you can see it's really peaked and rapping away as we speak. But if you go behind the Canterbury region, look at the various districts, certainly they're slightly different stories. Selwyn basically took off pretty much about a year after the first set of earthquakes and started building double to 3 times what they were normally building. And you can see there it's levelled off at about 3 times its normal level of activity. Wairakiriri was similar. It really shot away and it's levelled off about 3 times what it was normally building prior to the earthquakes as well. So it's taken up a lot of the heat out of the Christchurch market because we're building out in those 2 districts where we could get started and land was available a lot more quickly. If you look at Christchurch City, it's a slightly different story. It's only been in the last 12 months that Christchurch City itself is finally building, or rebuilding, I should say, as a result of the 3 years prior to that, we had very little activity. And that was because of all the complexities around claims and different types of land, etc., and it put massive pressure on the construction market because the builders who would normally build in that area had no business for a long time, and it was really hurting them. And we've actually seen more company collapses in Canterbury in the last 12 months than the rest of New Zealand. So there's a bit of a myth around all this huge amount of activity in Christchurch City, and the builders are having a field day. Well, that's not the case. Talk about Auckland, which is our, as you know, our problem child, if you like, when it comes to house prices. There's the level of activity there. We're building probably this year 6,500 new homes and apartments. Okay. At its peak, Auckland did about that number in 2003. When New Zealand as a whole, it did about 30,000 houses. Auckland has really been struggling for a long time on the back of those land prices and land affordability, etc., etc. And there you see it on the monthly basis. It's kind of getting there, but it's still pretty slow. We had a couple of good months at the end of last year, which came out of the blue, really. But the rest of it, it's pretty hard yakka. These are actually the houses that we're building, notwithstanding the Housing Accord has released up to, as the Minister said, potential of 23,000 properties. We're not building that number. We're building about 6. So why was the Reserve Bank policy so important? Well, we understand why they're trying to do it. They're trying to cool the Auckland housing market fundamentally. The Christchurch market was always going to take off simply because there's not enough houses there because of the earthquake, and that will come right. But we saw immediately that as soon as the local bank started implementing their quota system to get their book in order for their loan-to-value ratio, inquiries on new houses stopped. And it wasn't just people who had low deposits, it was the knock-on effect of people who couldn't sell their home because low deposit buyers couldn't buy them, who would have built. It was people who maybe had 20, 25% deposit but were worried about, construction cost increases during the period, and they couldn't top up at the end, which is quite normal. So we saw about 27% of all inquiries for new homes stop, virtually overnight. And that was potentially some 5,500 new homes would have been touched by the policy that were under risk. And that is why the Reserve Bank decided to exempt new homes. And those new homes that are currently being constructed now were inquiries 8 months ago. So today's inquiry is tomorrow's build. If you've got no inquiries today, there's a direct correlation between what you build or don't build in 6 or 8 months' time. So we would have been in a real hole now if we hadn't have managed to get that policy changed. Building Act changes, the bottom slide there talks about the Law Commission's review on joint and civil liability. It's about a year late, came out yesterday. No real change. They're going to keep that. That's the elephant in the room around innovation. It is a monster, and it really is. Although what they are going to do, they're recommending that they cap local authority liability from 2016 onwards at $300,000 per house, $150,000 per unit, and $3 million per development, because they believe by that stage all the weather tightness issues would have been finished, and hopefully that's to one side, and any major event coming forward, that's what they're recommending. Otherwise, J&S stays. And you really need to understand what a really problematic child that is. And I can see both sides of the story, because if you go to a proportionate liability process where you pay your proportion only and one of the parties isn't standing, then the poor old plaintiff, who's the homeowner, is left with nowhere to go. So there's real tensions in that space. So some quick forecasts. We've got here forecasts from brands. They're about 10% low at the moment, but you can see there they're predicting Auckland at about 12,000 from 2016 onwards, which is really that 39,000 houses per year that they're trying to get. Canterbury peaks about now for the next year or two, then starts to sort of go back to normal, and the rest of New Zealand continues to grow and then levels off. If you look at the chart here, which shows the Reserve Bank projections, Treasury projections and brands projections, this is the growth rate. We're currently in the fastest growth rate, the highest growth rate, what we're likely to see over the next 3 or 4 years. Continues to grow pretty strongly, but the growth rate slows. So we get back to normal around 2017. So Christchurch is a project. It's about 11,000 houses needed down there, and once that is done, the housing market theoretically should go back to normal. But at the moment, it's actually skewing our consent figures, because there's 4,000 or 5,000 houses there that aren't normally there. The forecasts for Auckland, of course, it really is, it's already been covered this morning several times. Auckland needs 400,000 dwelling units over the next 30 years to maintain its housing supply. That's 13,300 homes per year, every year, for the next 30 years. And it's done it once in 2013, and it's currently at 6. So it's got a long way to go for a long period of time. The housing accord and the special housing areas absolutely needed. Without that release of land, given the discussion I mentioned earlier, it's never going to happen. And that whole process is really about a catch-up for the last 20, 25 years of no land supply. So they're really in a bit of a problem. Wellington's has a similar issue down there at the moment as well. But really, we've got to get those numbers up. If we can make, instead of 1 in every, 5 homes being a new home, if you made it 1 in every 3, and you make land supply affordable, sections at 150,000, we'll build houses at 150,000. All right? So what we've actually got now in New Zealand is we don't have the 3-bedroom, 130 square metre house on an eighth of an acre anymore. That is gone, simply because land costs can't afford to build those houses. But we've replaced it with apartments and higher density accommodation, because that's the only way you can provide those small living accommodation units, simply because of the mathematics when it comes to economics around land. We've seen some examples out in Hobsonville where you can get those smaller properties, but they're on pocket handkerchief sections. Well, that's the cost, and that's where you need to go. So we've really gone away from, the quarter acre. Well, it never was a quarter acre, by the way. It was always about an eighth of an acre, about 500 or 600 square metres. We've gone away from those properties being built now. We've only got the existing housing stock, and they're the estate houses and the houses built in the 50s, 60s and 70s. Because we don't build 120 square metre houses anymore on sections of 500 square metres in New Zealand. Or we might in the West Coast or something, but we don't in Auckland. And that's it. We've gone pretty quickly. Are there any questions, or you want to?
Is that better? Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Warwick.